The bridge was quiet for one last moment. On March 7th, 1965, the line of marchers rose out of Selma and climbed toward the top of the Edmund Pettus Bridge under a bright Alabama sky. The river below moved in silence. The city behind them carried years of fear. Ahead of them stood state power in a hard, visible line. Troopers waited across the road. Sheriff's men waited on horseback. The marchers had not come with weapons. They had come with coats, small bags, walking shoes, prayer, discipline, and the belief that a citizen should be able to vote. Then the stillness ended. The order to turn back came. Then the officers moved. Gas entered eyes and lungs. Clubs struck backs, shoulders, and heads. Horses drove into a crowd that had nowhere easy to go. People dropped to the pavement. People covered their faces. People reached for each other through smoke and panic. People ran half-blind down the bridge towards Selma, trying to breathe, trying not to lose the bodies beside them. By evening, the bridge had become one of the most famous places in modern American history. But Bloody Sunday was not the beginning of Selma. The story began years earlier in courthouse lines, in church meetings, in local fear, and in the steady stubbornness of ordinary black citizens who kept returning after the city told them no. This is the true story of the Selma to Montgomery marches. Chapter 1. The City That Held the Door Shut. In Selma, Alabama, voting rights shaped ordinary life. Dallas County had a large black population, yet white officials held the courthouse, the sheriff's office, and the local political order. Without the vote, black citizens had little power to defend their jobs, schools, safety, or dignity. That is why the courthouse stood at the center of the struggle. A person could leave home early, put on careful clothes, lose a day's pay, and still spend hours in line, only to be turned away. That repeated experience taught people what the county ought of them. It taught them that exclusion could be made to look official, orderly, and normal. The refusal often came without one clean sentence. It came through delay, through narrow office hours, through forms and tests, through the quiet pleasure some officials seemed to take in making people wait. What looked bureaucratic from a distance felt personal on the ground. Every delay reminded black citizens that white power did not intend to share real citizenship, and the risk was larger than wasted time. People feared losing work. They feared landlords. They feared banks. They feared the simple fact that powerful white men could notice a face in line and remember it later. Standing at the courthouse was not only frustrating, it could be frightening. The walk there could feel long. The walk home could feel longer. Someone might ask where you had been. Someone might already know. That is why even joining the line became an act of public nerve. Selma was not only a place of bad rules, it was a place where the gap between American promises and daily life could be felt in the body. The vote meant more than one paper inside one office. It meant whether black citizens could force local power to answer to them at all. For many people, that pressure lived inside ordinary details. A man might stand in line with his hat in his hands and feel sweat gather under his collar even in cool weather. A woman might bring the right papers, say the right things, and still walk out of the courthouse with nothing but another long wait behind her. People learned to watch faces. Which deputy was standing near the door? Which white clerk looked amused? Who else in town had seen them enter? This is why Selma's voting struggle was never only about law. It was about how power entered the nerves. It was about how a citizen could feel smaller at noon than he had felt that morning. And it was about the decision, again and again, to return anyway. People were not fearless. They were often tired, wary, and angry. They returned because the alternative was a whole life spent under officials who never had to listen. That returning may look small from far away. In Selma, it was one of the great acts of the story. Long before television cameras came, local Black citizens had already been doing the hard work of organizing. Amelia Boynton had spent years pushing for voting rights. The Dallas County Voters League kept local pressure alive. Teachers, ministers, workers, and families built a movement that did not depend on one march or one national figure. Brown Chapel AME Church became the movement's center of gravity. It was not only a church, it was a room where fear could be spoken aloud. It was a room where plans could be argued over. It was a room where people could sit close together and feel for an hour or two that they were not facing Dallas County alone. That kind of place matters in long struggles. It gives tired people somewhere to return before they are asked to step back outside again. SNCC organizers Bernard and Colia Lafayette deepened that local work in 1963. Their organizing style was patient and demanding. It meant door-to-door conversation. It meant listening before speaking. It meant helping people prepare for humiliation before the humiliation came. It meant asking ordinary citizens to return to the courthouse after being insulted there. That kind of organizing did not always look dramatic. It looked like long evenings. It looked like names on paper. It looked like people deciding one by one that they would go again. Freedom Day on October 7, 1963, showed the meaning of that work. Hundreds of Black citizens came to register. Very few were processed. The line itself became testimony. The desire to vote was clearly there. The obstruction was clearly there, too. And when people left the courthouse tired, angry, or ashamed, Brown Chapel gave them somewhere to return. Inside the church there was prayer, singing, argument, silence, and the slow making of resolve. That local world matters because Selma was never a story only about famous men arriving. It was first a story about local people staying. Inside Brown Chapel, the movement learned how to hold both fear and discipline at the same time. The church could be warm with bodies, coats, hats, damp shoes, and tired voices after a long day. People listened to announcements. They passed news from one person to another. They counted who had been arrested and who had made it home. They asked who needed a ride, who needed food, who needed courage. A place like that did more than host meetings. It gave shape to endurance. It told local people that their struggle had memory, order, and company. That is why a building can matter so much in history. Brown Chapel held more than meetings. It held a public courage that might have died in isolation if people had been left alone in their own homes. People could come in carrying the day's humiliation and leave with a little more steadiness in their backs. Chapter 3. Pressure builds and fear becomes ordinary. By late 1964 and early 1965, Selma's struggle was drawing wider attention. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference became more deeply involved. Their presence brought national visibility, but Selma never stopped being a local fight. SNNC workers, local ministers, school teachers, neighborhood leaders, and the Dallas County Voters League all remained essential. This was a coalition, and coalitions under pressure are rarely simple. Different groups carried different habits and different ideas about pace, publicity, and risk. But beneath those differences stood one shared fact. Without voting rights, Black citizens in Dallas County would remain exposed to men who did not have to answer to them. Brown Chapel filled with more meetings and more urgency. The room could hold prayer 1 minute and argument the next. People knew what they were asking of each other. A march could lead to jail. A courthouse line could lead to lost wages. A night walk home could lead to a beating. Fear became ordinary in that sense. It sat inside daily decisions. Should you go to the courthouse again? Should you let your name be seen? Should you risk making the sheriff remember your face? The campaign kept growing because the old arrangement had become impossible to accept. Silence did not protect people enough. Waiting did not protect people enough. Delay itself had become a kind of injury. It taught people that exclusion could be made to look orderly and normal. And in Selma, many Black citizens were no longer willing to spend their whole lives asking politely for a door that local power intended to keep shut. That is why the campaign kept moving, not because the danger was small, but because the danger had already become part of ordinary life. That ordinary pressure helps explain why the campaign kept thickening instead of fading away. A person could only be told to wait for so many years. A teacher could only watch students grow into adults under the same locked system for so long. A minister could only pray over the same fears for so long. By early 1965, the movement in Selma was not running on sudden excitement. It was running on stored-up patience that had nearly reached its limit. Chapter 4. Marion and the Death of Jimmie Lee Jackson. The immediate road to the marches began in nearby Marion. On the night of February 18, 1965, civil rights supporters and local residents took part in a protest there. Officers attacked the crowd. Streetlights were broken. The town dropped into confusion and darkness. People ran without being able to see clearly where the next blow might come from. In that violence, Jimmie Lee Jackson was shot while trying to protect members of his family. He was 26 years old. He was not trying to become a symbol. He was trying to shield the people he loved in a night of fear. He died on February 26th. His death changed the emotional weight of the movement. The struggle in Selma had already been dangerous, but now it had a funeral. It had a grieving family. It had a young man whose absence could be felt in a room. Mourners did not need abstract language to understand what had happened. They had seen where the old order could lead. The plan to march from Selma to Montgomery rose out of that grief. The march would demand voting rights. It would also refuse to let Jackson's death remain small, local, and easy for the nation to ignore. Pain would be carried onto the highway. A local funeral would become a public road. That is one of the deepest truths in Selma. Private grief became public action. The people who had buried one of their own now prepared to walk toward the state capitol and make the country look at what Alabama was doing. Jackson's death also changed the feel of the meetings that followed. The movement was no longer speaking only about blocked forms and courthouse delay. Now it was speaking in the shadow of a killing. People could picture the family. They could picture the night. They could picture what it meant for a mother, a father, or a sister to wait for news that would not come back gentle. That kind of grief does not make a movement calmer. It makes it heavier. And in Selma, that weight moved toward the road. It also changed the sound of the campaign. After Jackson, every plan carried a deeper sorrow underneath it. Chapter 5. Bloody Sunday. On March 7th, about 600 marchers left Brown Chapel. John Lewis of SNCC and Hosea Williams of SCLC walked at the front. The line moved through Selma with calm discipline. Some people sang quietly. Some prayed. Some saved their breath and kept their eyes forward. When the marchers came over the top of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they saw the blockade waiting on the far side. State troopers stood across the highway. Sheriff's men sat ready on horseback. The command to disperse came. Then the officers advanced. What followed lasted only minutes, but it carried the force of years. Gas filled mouths and eyes. Clubs struck shoulders, ribs, arms, and heads. Horses plunged into a crowd with nowhere easy to go. People bent over coughing. People reached for the railing. People reached for each other. People stumbled down the bridge half blind, trying to find air, trying not to lose the bodies beside them. John Lewis suffered a fractured skull. Many others were bloodied and injured. But Bloody Sunday mattered not only because the violence was severe, it mattered because the violence was plain. This was the state of Alabama attacking peaceful citizens who wanted the right to vote. For years, local black citizens had known the meaning of that power. Now the whole country could see it. The bridge did not create the truth of Selma, it exposed it. For the marchers themselves, Bloody Sunday was not only a picture seen later on television, it was a bodily memory. The sting in the eyes, the shock of the first blow, the panic of not knowing where to run because the road behind had filled with bodies and the road ahead had filled with force. Some people remembered the choking. Some remembered the sound of hooves. Some remembered trying not to leave anyone behind. That physical truth matters. Selma changed the country through law and politics, but it also changed people through memory carried inside the body. Because those memories were carried by so many different people at once, the bridge did not remain a private wound. It became a national moral image tied to living lungs, bruised ribs, and terrified eyes. The contrast stayed in the mind. Peaceful citizens on foot, state power on the attack. That visual contrast helped pull people south. It called ministers, students, and ordinary supporters into the struggle. Chapter 6. The Nation Looks South. Television and photographs carried Bloody Sunday into homes across the United States. A person sitting in a northern living room could now watch smoke spread across the bridge, mounted officers charge forward, and frightened citizens run for safety. What had happened in Selma could no longer be explained away as rumor, exaggeration, or local misunderstanding. The evidence was visual and immediate. The country saw citizens attacked by the state for demanding voting rights. That changed the scale of the struggle. Religious leaders traveled south, students traveled south. Ordinary people who had never heard of Dallas County now knew the name Selma. For local Black families, that new attention brought mixed feelings. It brought support, it brought witnesses, but it did not remove the fact that they still had to sleep in Selma, wake in Selma, and step back into Selma streets after the visitors went to bed. Inside Brown Chapel, the movement felt both larger and heavier. More supporters were arriving, but so was more pressure. Each new day carried the weight of national attention. And still, the local people at the heart of the movement had to breathe, sleep, mourn, and prepare for what came next. The world outside now knew the name Selma. The people inside Selma still had to live there. The cameras could leave. The fear in town did not leave with them. This is why Brown Chapel remained so important after Bloody Sunday. It was where the movement gathered itself. It was where courage had to be renewed. It was where people looked at each other's tired faces and still decided to continue. That decision did not erase fear. It only proved that fear had not won. When the second march took place on March 9th, Martin Luther King Jr. led it. But the situation remained uncertain. A federal order had not yet clearly protected the route. Another attack was possible. When the marchers reached the bridge, King stopped, knelt, prayed, and then turned the line around. The decision became known as Turnaround Tuesday. For people inside the movement, the moment was not simple. Some saw caution, some felt confusion, some felt a hurt very close to betrayal. The movement was trying to stay alive while the whole nation watched. Then another death deepened the crisis. James Reeb, a white minister from Boston who had come to support the campaign, was attacked in Selma. He died on March 11th. His death widened national attention even further. But for local Black families, the deepest meaning was not that the struggle had finally become important. It was that the danger they had always lived with was now impossible for the country to ignore. That gave the days after Bloody Sunday a double feeling. Support had arrived. Danger was still close. People could feel both truths in the same hour. Movements do not move in one clean line. They stop. They argue, they disappoint each other, they bury the dead, then they gather again. Selma's power came partly from the fact that the movement kept gathering again. Each gathering carried the memory of who had already been lost. That gave even the quieter moments a grave weight. Chapter 7. The President, the Judge, and the Opening of the Road. On March 15th, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed Congress. He called for voting rights legislation and used the movement's own words, "We shall overcome." The speech mattered because it showed that Selma had pushed the struggle into the center of national power. It did not make Alabama safe, but it made the issue harder for the federal government to avoid. For listeners across the country, the speech sounded like a turning point. For people in Selma, it sounded like one step that still had to be tested on the road. 2 days later, Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. ruled that the marchers had the right to proceed. The road to Montgomery would open. That ruling mattered because it changed the next march from a question into a journey. The bridge had shown the country what Alabama was doing. Now federal authority was beginning at last to answer. For the movement, that did not end fear. It changed the shape of it. People still had to walk. They still had to endure the road with their own bodies, but now they would do it under legal protection that the whole country could see. For many marchers, the days between the ruling and the third march carried a different kind of tension. The road had opened in law, but bodies still had to enter that road. People still had to sleep, wake, lace their shoes, and trust that federal protection would hold. Hope was present, so was caution. The next march would not erase fear. It would ask people to walk with fear and keep going. That may be the best way to understand courage in Selma. It was rarely clean. It was people moving forward while fully aware of the risks still standing there with them. In those days, preparation itself carried emotion. People checked shoes. People thought about distance. People wondered how their bodies would hold up if the road truly stayed open all the way to Montgomery. Chapter 8. 5 Days to Montgomery. The third march began on March 21. This time, the road to Montgomery would truly open. The distance was about 54 miles. Federal protection stood around the marchers, but protection did not remove fatigue. Feet swelled, legs tightened. The road stretched out mile after mile under changing weather. At night, people slept in temporary camps beside the route. They lay on the ground or on simple bedding, listened to the dark around them, and woke with tired bodies still needing to move. Some were stiff before sunrise. Some rubbed sore calves and swollen feet before standing up to walk again. Some shared food. Some spoke quietly in the dark about what waited in Montgomery and what might still wait for them when they returned home. This part of Selma's story matters because it was not only a burst of moral drama, it was endurance. It was prayer mixed with sore muscles. It was public courage carried in ordinary bodies. The marchers did not float toward history. They walked toward it on aching feet. As the days passed, the crowd grew larger. More supporters joined. The line became bigger, louder, and more visible. By the time it reached Montgomery on March 25, thousands had gathered. At the state capitol, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke. For many marchers, that arrival carried mixed feelings. There was pride. There was exhaustion. There was the strange calm that can come when a person has been moving toward one hard point for days and suddenly stands there at last. But even in that historic moment, violence had not vanished. Victory was real. So was danger. That is part of what makes Selma feel so human. There was no clean, magical ending waiting at the Capitol steps. There were tired bodies, heavy hearts, and a future still being fought over. The march had reached its visible goal. The conflict itself had not ended. That 5-day march changed the rhythm of the story. Bloody Sunday had been sudden and violent. The road to Montgomery was slower. It was not built from one burst of shock. It was built from miles, from waking up stiff, from walking with sore feet, from eating what people could get, from talking quietly beside the road, from seeing the state capitol draw nearer one day at a time. That long movement gave the campaign a different kind of moral force. It showed not only courage in crisis, it showed stamina. It showed a people refusing to let their demand break apart after the first shock. Chapter 9. After the March. That same night, after the march reached Montgomery, Viola Liuzzo was murdered by Klansmen while helping transport marchers. Her death made clear that the road from Selma had not reached safety. The campaign had moved the nation, it had not removed hatred. On August 6, 1965, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. Selma helped push the nation toward that law. Registration increased, representation changed. A door that had long been held shut began to open. Registration could now move in ways that had been blocked for years. That change mattered in town offices, in county politics, and in the simple question of whether Black citizens could make officials fear losing power. For the first time in many places, the old certainty of white control had to face a new fact. Black citizens could register, organize, and vote in larger numbers. For some older Black citizens, that change carried the weight of years. People who had known long courthouse delay could now feel a different kind of tension in the same public spaces. The question was no longer only whether they would be admitted, it was whether the law would finally hold when they stepped forward. That moment could be quiet and still heavy. An older man could walk back toward the courthouse with papers in his hand and feel years of refusal pressing on the same steps. A woman could stand in line again and feel her stomach tighten, not because she doubted the law on paper, but because she knew the faces inside the office. The law had changed. The room had not changed in the same quick way. That is how history often feels in real life. New law, old walls, and citizens testing which one will hold. But no honest ending should pretend that one law erased fear, inequality, or local resistance overnight. The same people who marched still had to go home. They still had to live in the same counties, pass the same hostile faces on the street, and build power where old power remained angry and watchful. The same courthouse still stood there. The same public rooms still had to be entered. The same old eyes still looked back across the desk. That is how slowly public change can arrive in private rooms. It includes local people who kept working after cameras left. They still had to register voters. Even after the law, local work did not disappear. People still had to help neighbors register. They still had to challenge local habits of intimidation. They still had to prove that a right on paper could become a right in practice. That meant registration work, local organizing, and the slow testing of whether county power would truly bend. For local people, that afterlife of Selma was not less important than the march itself. It was where history had to survive after applause ended. That is where Selma kept living, not only in speeches, not only in law, in county offices, in registration lines, in the long test of whether Black citizens could stand in public life and be counted at last. Epilogue. Remember the bridge, but remember this too. Selma was never only one day on one road. It was ordinary people refusing to step back into silence. And because they refused, the country moved.